Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the closing conference ceremony for Journalism Under Fire. My name is Sandy Campbell, of course. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations, and I can't believe it, but we've made it to the finish line of this amazing 30 live streams over 4 weeks of conference. And I know that we've all learned some really important things about how journalists cover crisis, which is this year's conference theme. I know I sure have. In this time of crisis, of environmental crisis, social crisis, political crisis, so this pandemic that never ends, we know that we need our journalists more than ever. They are our eyes and ears. They're in the public squares that we ourselves cannot be. And we've had some truly exceptional journalists take us behind the scenes and into their world. We had Wesley Lowery, Estede Herndon, and Hannah Allam, and the reporting on race, Black Lives Matter, and the long roots of today's social crises. We had Nick Kristof and EJ Dion provide rich context for an analysis of our contested presidential election. We had Maria Ressa and Patricia Campos Mello help us understand the grave challenges of covering regimes that attack and intimidate a free press. And I, for one, am so deeply grateful that we've had these voices, these true stars giving us the light we need in this time, for helping us understand that today's crises stretch far into the past, and even with a new presidential administration, will continue to shadow the future. Their light is essential because we all understand, that democracy demands sunlight. We've educated ourselves in these 4 weeks, we really have, and it's our best response in these times. Education is without any doubt our world's silver bullet. It's the one thing that helps us see and understand and hopefully solve the many problems we have so that all of us can move forward. And of course, we here in New Mexico have some extraordinary challenges in education, where 1 in 3 school-age children live in poverty, where our state consistently ranks 49th in education. And that is where I hope you will join us next. This year, among other programs in New Mexico schools, we're working with 30 outstanding high school fellows, all of them high-achieving students, all of them curious about the world, and yet all of them in a constrained educational system that often can't meet their needs. They are our future, and in some cases, they are our future journalists. And so let me appeal to you tonight to support our mission of enriching their lives with global awareness and the smarts they need to thrive. Make a donation to our education programs. Help support our Fellows Fund, which, when travel resumes, will send our fellows overseas for exchange opportunities and language intensives. Or why not become a member in our organization? Or if you already are a member, why not give the gift of membership to a family friend, or to a family, to a friend, to a loved one? All membership dues go to supporting our free and accessible to all programs across New Mexico schools, from Navajo Prep in Farmington to Capitol High School on Santa Fe's South Side. Becoming a member or giving the gift of membership is easy. Just visit sfcir.org/members. One last thing before we kick off tonight. While we all read this country's major newspapers, let me remind you to support our local journalists. Without them, without their ability to report on our state, on our leadership, on our response to crisis, we're lost. So renew your subscription to the Santa Fe New Mexican, to the Albuquerque Journal. Read and support Searchlight New Mexico, the Santa Fe Reporter, the Albuquerque Alibi, and New Mexico in Depth. Listen to and support KSFR and PBS. We have the power, we know we do, to help our own media survive this time of crisis. So with that said, let me bring on one of journalism's under fire's biggest and brightest stars, Dana Priest, a 2-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for the Washington Post and the Knight Chair for Public Affairs Journalism at the University of Maryland. Good evening, Dana.
Good evening, Sandy. It's so nice to be with you again.
How are you doing tonight?
I'm fine. I'm really looking forward to tonight. We have some great guests, and we're going to have a lot of insight into our question and beyond.
Yes, you have moderated a number of our panels over this conference. Is there any one thing that sort of jumps out at you of something unique or something that you learned or something that you were just, proud to be a part of?
Well, I have to say it's Maria Ressa and the talk that we had with her and the filmmaker who has just completed a documentary about her. Maria has more energy than anybody I've ever met. but she just has so many intellectual balls in the air at all time, and she has to juggle her personal safety in the most serious way, and the safety of her colleagues. And she's really confronting something that we have never confronted in this country, and really rarely do any journalists confront that kind of onslaught. And she just seems to remain, dogged and determined. She could come to this country and live. She's a dual citizen, but she won't do it. And it's very inspiring and incredibly humbling to listen to someone like that. It puts your own issues in perspective. And so I would have to say, I will always cherish, and I'll always listen in my head to the likes of Maria Ressa, what
It
she has to.
was it was an amazing talk. The documentary A Thousand Cuts is extraordinary. A look at her many challenges in the Philippines. If you missed it, fear not. It's on our YouTube channel. It's really worth a watch. Um, but Dana, we have a lot of ground to cover tonight. We have a lot of
We do.
folks we need to hear
We do.
from.
We do.
So let me call on Joel Simon to join us here tonight. And just while Joel's connecting, there's Joel. Hey Joel, how are you?
I'm great. How are you? It's great to be with you. Hi, Dana.
Hi, Joel.
Thanks for
Nice to
joining
see
us. Before I turn this conversation over to the two of you, let me quickly introduce Joel. He's been the executive director of CPJ since 2006, and he created a new North America program focused on press freedom advocacy in the United States, and is helping to develop an emergency response team focused on safety and direct assistance to journalists in crisis around the world. Joel's written widely on press freedom issues for publications, is a regular columnist for the Columbia Journalism Review, and let me quickly add, the Committee to Protect Journalists, or CPJ as we call it, has been a partner on Journalism Under Fire from day one. We're enormously grateful for that support and that partnership. And I can tell you, your organization is one I greatly admire, and I wish you, all the best in the amazing and difficult work that you do around the world. So welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much, and it's humbling to hear you say that. Frankly, I wish we weren't so visible and so needed. It's for all the wrong reasons, but that kind of acknowledgement really means the world to us. So thank you.
Well, thank you,
Yeah,
Joel. Dana, let me turn it over to you.
yeah. I have to say, personally, when I met Joel about 5 years ago, and I was working with students that I teach about press freedom issues, we thought it is so terrible what's happening around the world. But these days, I think of Joel every day. I really do, Joel, because every single day there's either a journalist around the world that is being killed or imprisoned or harassed on social media. It's only gotten so much worse, and I don't know how personally you do it. And I just want to take my hat off and say I don't have a hat, but I would if I did, and to say thank you. And I wanted to start by asking you to tell us something that the committee, that the organization does that we might not know about. Since you can go on your website and see your great statistics and that kind of thing, but what do you do behind the scenes that you can give us an idea about?
Well, I think what I'm going to talk about is our emergency response team
Oh,
and the work that we do to assist journalists who are under threat around the world. When CPJ was founded, it was almost um, 4 decades ago, and the idea at that time was that journalists in the United States were working from a position of privilege. It was sort of after the Watergate era. This is a distant memory to many folks, but journalists were sometimes considered almost heroic figures, and the American media was strong, and it brought down a president. And the sense was, U.S. journalists are working from this position of privilege. We have to stand up and defend the rights of our colleagues around the world who don't have a First Amendment, who don't have the same kind of legal protections, who don't have the same kind of strong institutions. And so the focus of CPJ was always, let's use journalism to defend the rights of our colleagues. Let's document the violations against them. Let's report when we're an organization of journalists. So we bring those tools. Let's report on the threats against them. Let's confront governments that engage in patterns of abuse. But at a certain point, we realized, that's an important area of work. But if you're a journalist and you've got to leave your house because people are coming to kill you, or if you're in jail and your family doesn't have support, You need something. Journalism isn't going to feed you, and journalism isn't going to keep you safe. So we set up a whole infrastructure that actually provides direct assistance to journalists under threat. And in many instances, we really can't talk about this.
Hmm.
It's under the radar because it's actually gonna make things worse for the journalists. But we support dozens and dozens of journalists around the world directly. And I'll tell you just one story, something that I'm immensely proud of. About 2 years ago, there was a group of journalists in Syria who had basically they had fled various parts of the country and they concentrated in Aleppo because there was a safe haven there, and they were basically under threat from the Assad regime, and the Assad regime was anticipated it would be moving into Aleppo. There were about 5 dozen journalists, and they were all going to be dead. They were all going to be killed, and we actually orchestrated a kind of international evacuation. We were able to help relocate dozens of these journalists, many um, to Europe and within the region, and many of them have resettled, resumed their lives. And that's the kind of work that our emergencies team does day after day.
Yeah, it's very complex and, as you say, very sensitive. So thank you for sharing that insight. Let's go to today for a while and talk about the legacy of Donald Trump and the media, both in the United States, but as a representative of the United States around the world.
Yeah, I mean, the data, they reinforce one another. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about Trump's strategy, vis-a-vis the media, and he's made this plain. He explained it to Leslie Stahl. Everyone cites it all the time. He told her in an interview that he attacks the media because he doesn't want people to believe the critical things that
Mhm.
journalists publish about him, and he has undermined not just journalists but a whole range of experts because experts challenge him and he wants to create his own reality and journalists make it difficult for him to do that. It's also, but one of the challenges that in confronting Trump is that every time he attacks the media and attacks an individual journalist and calls journalists fake news and enemy of the people and threatens to put them in jail, and whatever other antics he engages in, it actually becomes a bit of a distraction. Sometimes the media itself shifts the story from the underlying thing that
Yes.
he's upset about, which is what we should be paying attention to the attacks on the journalists themselves. So there's a trap there that I think the media sometimes falls into. But there's no question, that he is quite deliberately, undermined journalism in this institution, undermined the role of the press, weakened a critical institution of democracy. We've talked about that in this country. There's been a lot of focus on that, but I do want to talk about what the impact has been around the world. One thing that I think people may not be aware of is we've seen record numbers of journalists in prison around the world during the Trump era. We may
Mhm.
well set another record this year. Now,
Mhm.
there are lots of complex reasons for this. The kind of systematic repression of journalism preceded Trump, but we've certainly seen a surge of imprisonments, and many journalists are being jailed on fake news charges, false news charges. This is a new strategy that authoritarian governments have appropriated and used to justify suppressing information and imprisoning journalists. They just call it fake news. And Patricia Campos Melo, who I know participated in the discussion as part of this conference, we actually had an opportunity to meet with Vice President Pence when she came to as part as a CPJ honoree along with other journalists from India and Pakistan and Tanzania, and they all told the vice president how leaders in their countries had appropriated this language of fake news, of attacking and vilifying the press, and it had real consequences. It had consequences in terms of their safety. It had consequences in terms of their ability to do their job. It has actually, I think, disrupted the free flow of information around the world in a profound way. So that example that the U.S. set for the world, the power of U.S. foreign policy to stand up and defend journalists, which of course was never exercised perfectly, what was there, that's gone. And I think we're all the poorer as a result.
And so, what do you think a new presidential administration can do to reverse this? And what would you actually want to see them do as in the first
Yeah.
like month, 100 days?
Well, I've actually have a whole CPJ's published a white paper on our website, and you can find it there at
Mhm.
cpj.org with a series of recommendations. Some of the reversing some of the damage is going to take a very long time, and it may not even be possible because it has to do with U.S. credibility and standing in the
Mm.
world and leadership, and that's going to take a long time to rebuild if it's even possible. But the one thing that a President Biden can do and a Biden administration can do right away that is important is change the rhetoric. That's
Mhm.
not that hard to do, but it can't be done in a subtle way. It can't be done just through the regular interactions with journalists. And of course, Biden isn't going to call journalists enemy of the people and fake news and insult them. That we know that, but that's not just not insulting them is not going to be sufficient. We're actually calling on President Biden to give a major speech about the importance of press freedom. He could do it in the context of talking about democracy and human rights, but it's very important because
Mhm.
Trump has specifically gone after journalists that he gives some broader public discourse about the role of journalism, not just in the American context, but in the global context. And in terms of foreign policy, we've actually called on the Trump, the Biden administration, rather, to appoint a special presidential envoy for
Mm.
press freedom. Why? Because the State Department bureaucracy that has traditionally stood up for journalists and press freedom has been essentially dismantled. And it's going to take a long time to rebuild and to get people confirmed, the assistant secretaries that normally do this kind of work. And we need somebody on day one who's going to go out and talk about this every time a journalist is threatened or put in jail or harassed. Is going to make a point of putting pressure on the Philippines around the Maria Ressa case, is going to pressure the Saudis to bring justice for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. That's not going to happen unless there's a key point person within the administration who's got that public role. And we think it should be temporary because ultimately you have to rebuild the State Department infrastructure, but that's going to take time. And we believe that from day one, the Biden administration really needs to be out there publicly on press freedom.
Oh, that's fascinating. So, have you gotten any sense of what they what the reaction is to that?
Well, I mean, transitions are chaotic. So
Yeah.
we're talking to a lot of different people, and we expect that we'll start, having meetings. Once it not happen till after,
Mm.
the new administration has been is in place and the president has been inaugurated. But we've gotten, people are taking it seriously. I think the point is whether it's a special presidential envoy or some other way of expressing this commitment. I think everyone recognizes that it has to happen. And we haven't talked about the pandemic, about
Right.
COVID-19, but that really is one of the reasons because it's really an example of what happens when information does not flow freely. So supporting journalists, of course it's good for journalists, it's good for people like us, but it actually advances U.S. strategic interests. I mean, think about what would have happened if China had had a free press, if journalists had been able to report on the outbreak in Wuhan instead of the government censoring. Think
Mhm.
about all the information that we're lacking about enormous outbreaks in Egypt, in Iran, in Mexico. The dynamic is very different there. But there are so many places around the world where we don't have good data, we don't have good information. And one of the reasons is because journalists are not able to work freely. So, in the midst of a pandemic, we really need journalists to be able to operate freely in this country, certainly, but also around the world.
Can you explain what the pandemic allowed repressive governments to do to journalists? So I'm not sure everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I call it the COVID crackdown, and let me tell you why. There've been a series of in the last 10 years or more, there have been a series of key events that have led to sharp increases in repression. One was the September 11th and the war on terror. You saw governments around the world embrace this rhetoric of combating terrorism, and there were new anti-terror laws. And we saw a surge of repression, a surge of repression, and a sharp increase in the number of journalists in prison around the world. Then, after the Arab Spring, we saw another sharp increase because governments around the world were extremely threatened by independent information, and they understood that if they couldn't control information, that it threatened their ability to retain power. And we saw another surge in repression. And now, taking those two events into account, this is the worst and most sweeping period of repression that I've ever witnessed right now, because every country around the world, pretty much, has put in place some sort of restrictions on the flow of information, some more direct than others, obviously, and they've done it under the guise of combating misinformation, protecting public health, and there have been sweeping, regulations put in place to restrict the flow of information in certain contexts. The thing that's challenging about this is it's harder to measure.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a slightly different dynamic. It's not necessarily the same kind of direct repression, but what we are seeing are governments asserting more authority and greater power, governments around the world limiting the flow of information, and also using the platforms that they have, political leaders, to undermine information and put forth an alternative narrative that the pandemic isn't happening, it's not as bad as people think, and that also is a threat.
You're talking about social media as their
yeah. I mean, again, I think you could point to a couple of leaders who've engaged in this strategy, democratic leaders. One is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and I'm sure you heard about that from Patricio Campos Melo. He's basically called the COVID-19 a little flu. He's denied and dismissed the seriousness of it. And then you have Narendra Modi in India. He's asserted broad and sweeping powers there and cracked down on the press. Again, when there have been reports about the scope of the outbreak and the extent of it. And then in this country, of course, I mean, President Trump's whole electoral strategy was to deny the seriousness of the pandemic and to suggest that that it was a conspiracy essentially to undermine his political authority. And so that led, of course, to direct attacks on experts in journalism and an attack on information. And we see the consequences of that. We're living with it today.
So what do you think, if we look back at the last election, we were all hot and bothered about Facebook and disinformation, from the Russians, but others. So how do you think the social media companies, in particular Twitter and Facebook, but also Instagram and TikTok, are they being used in the same way? Is it just what do you think?
They've responded pretty effectively to the last threat. But we have a new threat. The last threat was the external, the Russians and other external actors manipulating the information space. And I think that's more difficult now because the companies are much more sophisticated about that sort of thing. And they have, at first they were dismissive, but now they recognize it's a real issue and they've taken steps. But the problem is that disinformation isn't coming from Russia, it's coming from the president. So that is an infinitely more complex undertaking, and I get that when that it's gotten to the point where social media companies really have no choice but to restrict the circulation of President Trump's outbursts on social media, but that's really not a good place for them to be in terms of our democracy. I mean, I understand why they feel compelled to do that, but it's dragging them right into the midst of the political fray. They're deciding what information people have access to, that is going to boomerang. That is
Okay,
going
so
to.
what's the alternative?
There isn't. Everyone always asks that, and I was been writing about this. There isn't some single solution. I think you need, and I think what it's broadly reflects is our own political dysfunction. It's such a complex issue that we need a legislature, a Congress that can actually have informed, thoughtful debates about the role of social media in our society and not turn it into like a political meat grinder. But
Mhm.
there are a range of things that have to happen. I mean, there's questions about antitrust. There's questions about what's called Section 230, the kind of exemption that allows social media companies to not have any liability for information posted by third parties. There's a question about how broad that protection should be. Should it be modified in some way? There are questions about other kinds of liability. There are questions about some
Mm.
sort of regulation. It's going to take so many different. There isn't one single solution. It's going to take thoughtful engagement with this problem through our political institutions. And the problem is they are so dysfunctional that dysfunction is reflected in the kind of information landscape. And one other point I'll make about this, Dana, is as bad as it is here, it's having even worse impacts around the world, because at least the social media companies feel some sort of accountability to the US Congress.
Right.
And they're worried about some sort of oversight and regulation. They're not worried about, oversight and regulation in Myanmar or Vietnam or Nigeria or so many other places around the world where these issues are at the fore.
Yeah, I like to point to Europe just to get out of the depressing hole that this, leads you into, because Europe does regulate, and it probably has the best solution so far to social media.
I think what's happening in Europe is really interesting. They are much more effective at regulating, and it's had an impact. But I also think the challenge there is that the companies are based here,
Yeah.
and the market is here, and the real accountability is within a U.S.
Mhm.
domestic context. So what's happening in Europe is interesting and important, but it's not a global
Yeah.
solution.
Okay. So we have so many different kinds of people listening: older, younger, students, people from. I think there's at least one, but maybe several journalists from Cameroon and other African countries. What can individuals do to help resolve any of the issues? Just pick one that you've outlined, because I don't want to leave people feeling
Yeah.
can't do
Well,
anything.
look, I mean, but my job is to defend journalists, and it's bad out there for journalists. So if you ask me to talk
So
about what
love
I'm
a
doing,
journalist.
you're gonna hear some horror stories. But what can we as individuals do? And I think we have to recognize that people who are um, watching us now care about journalism. They're either
Right.
journalists themselves or they care deeply about it, and that's what we need. We need people like those who are taking
Mhm.
the time to tune in and watch this, who value not just journalists because they're out there doing
'Cause
their
they're
job,
cool.
but because of what the function they play within our society of providing us with independent information. And they want to be informed, and they want to make up their minds, and they want to have the information they need to engage as citizens. Really, that's the most important thing that people can do. And that also honestly means, investing in journalism, being willing to pay for it,
Right.
wherever you are in the world. And so I think the simplest and most important thing that people, I mean, there are a lot of other things you can do, but the simplest and most important thing is be an informed citizen.
Mhm.
Be an informed citizen. And that means engaging with journalism in an informed and responsible way and supporting it. Because the more people we have who do that and do that on a regular basis, the healthier journalism will be.
Great. That's a great place to end. And thank you so much for your time
Thanks,
and
Dana. Great to
Thank you,
speak with
Joel.
you.
your endless wisdom on all these subjects. It's really amazing. Hang in there.
I will. I will. Thank you so much for the encouragement.
Okay.
Thanks for
Take care.
doing this, Joel.
See ya.
Bye bye.
Well, let me jump in really quickly to introduce our next speaker, who really needs little introduction, but let me introduce him anyway. Bob Woodward, welcome to the program. Bob is an associate editor of the Washington Post, where he's worked since 1971. He shared in 2 Pulitzer Prizes, first in 1973 for the coverage of the Watergate scandal, and then in 2003 as the lead reporter for coverage of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Most recently, he's the author of a book I think we've heard of, Rage, all about the presidency of Donald J. Trump. Welcome, Bob. We're thrilled to have you here with us tonight.
So you have to unmute. Okay.
So while he's doing that, let me just remind folks.
Okay, I think I did it.
Yeah.
Did I?
Okay. Welcome. So Dana and Bob will speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll take audience Q&A. So please, folks, get your questions into the Q&A box. And Dana and Bob, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks for being here. And
Thank you.
I can't think of anyone more qualified to reflect on the current president and also on our theme tonight, which is crises in journalism. And we came up with the theme a year ago before the pandemic. So we have, a lot to talk about. But I did want to start with, obviously anybody who's read your books has to be thinking, how do you keep doing this? How do you keep weaseling your way into the deepest bowels of the one administration after another? But I personally want to.
Wait a minute. Weasel is the wrong verb.
Well, okay. What would be the right verb?
Well, I want to talk. I want to understand. I'm willing to listen. I'm patient. On this book, which Rage, that Trump didn't like initially, said it was a political hit job. He then said he read it in one night, which I'm not sure I believe, and that it's boring. But on Fox News, they asked him, is it accurate? And he said, it's okay, it's fine. And that he had said some things that he thought were really great. So he gets his say.
Well, I wanted to know how, so when you did your first book on him, Fear, he called it fiction. And then he trotted out a lot of other names of people who were there at the time, no longer there, Mattis and others, who also said they said it was fiction. So my question is, how did you then get him to come and do this again, but even more times, 18 interviews?
Well, yes, he was not willing to be interviewed for the first book, Fear, which came out in 2018. And what he did denounce it, and he doesn't read. I think that's the best evidence. And some people who worked for him went to him and said, it's all true. And he wants to do another one. And so Trump agreed to talk. And I mean, no one knows better than you that people like to talk. People believe, even people who step on and violate the First Amendment kind of believe in the spirit of it. Let's get things out. And so we started talking, and over 9 months, I did 17 or 18 interviews with him. He would call here on this phone at night, or I would call him. I had a number where I could reach him, and I could. Again, you're the master of this. You chart out your questions. You get to know people. You go back. The process, I think, was appealing to him because and he said, you're asking me questions that people have not really asked me as much about.
Okay. So do you have like a red phone for the president? How do you know that it was him who was calling? Maybe you didn't, at a certain point in the evening, maybe you don't want to answer any more phone calls, but then the red phone rings or something. How'd you do that? How'd you make sure you always answered the phone?
Well, it's just a regular phone, and he has the most recognizable voice in the world, I think.
Yeah.
And when once he called, my wife Elsa picked up, and said, "Is Bob there?" And she said, "Who's calling?" And he said, "Donald Trump." And so the process continued. He really got a, it's the title of the book, Rage, comes from him. Back in 2016, interviewing him, and he said in a straightforward way, he brings out rage in people. He doesn't know whether it's positive or negative, which is interesting. And it really, I mean, this is the era of rage, isn't it? I mean, this is.
How would you explain the rage he seems to have inside of him that comes out in crowds in particular, but not uniquely in crowds?
Happily, I'm not a psychiatrist any more than you are, and explaining these things is very difficult. I think I was listening to something this morning, and somebody from the CIA was saying there's the CIA salute. Do you know what the CIA salute is? The CIA salute is, who knows?
Oh.
we don't know. It's a mystery. Which, of course, the CIA specializes in mysteries, even if they shouldn't be.
Did you ever ask him about? Did you ever ask him about his mannerisms when he speaks and his emotion when he speaks and where that comes from, or anything like that?
No, you mean at the rallies and
At the
so
rallies,
forth?
but also at the rallies, but also his language is so disrespectful to people. Often, I don't know. Did you
Yeah,
get?
but I was interested. Look, there are, as we always call it in our business, the tall poles in the tent.
Right.
And he's the tallest of poles. He's the only pole in many ways. But the pandemic is so significant in defining our lives. The economic crisis that we are in, really, we are in an economic catastrophe that people don't fully realize. Tens of millions of people who don't have stock or money or security realize it. We have a racial uprising taking place, and we are in in this situation of division. I said to him at one point, I said, "You're president of two Americas," and he acknowledged this. And I think I mean, again, this is like rage is a good thing and a bad thing. Division is something he uses, and well, he uses it a lot.
Yeah. Could you give us a little bit more behind the scenes of how you work as a journalist? And you asked him. We heard on the tapes that you released. You asked him some questions that he wasn't happy that you asked him. And at some point he says you drink the Kool-Aid. So he's obviously kind of miffed at some of the questions. How do you keep somebody from getting so mad at your questions that they just don't want to answer anymore? How do you do that? Did you ask?
Well, I think it's a matter of tone. And on, for instance, race relations, after George Floyd was killed May 25th, there was this upheaval taking place. And so I asked him, but I asked it in the context of him. Said, "You're from white privilege. I'm from white privilege. And don't we have some responsibility to understand the pain and anger of Black people?" And that's when he blew up. And I mean, it's remarkable. He said, just mocks me. "Oh, Bob, you drank the Kool-Aid. I don't feel that at all." And I think in that case, he was telling the truth. I think he doesn't feel that at all.
Did you have to do any repairing of that blow up before he would continue to answer more questions from you?
No.
Okay.
You just go on, and he was interested in he didn't tell anyone. in the White House. No one in the White House knew he was doing this. And there was no press monitor there. There was no chief of staff. There was, nothing. Once Melania came into the room and she said hello, but that was it. It's a straight transaction, and I think sometimes in journalism we think we have to come in with our list of questions. And why'd you steal the money? Why'd you do this? Why do you hate, whatever? And we need to make it more of a conversation, that we need to be patient, and that we really need to, it sounds a little strange, but even with the president, you want to make it clear to them you take them as clearly as seriously as they take themselves. Everyone in Washington, takes themselves seriously, and so you can't come in. I had to know what he had said that day. I had to know the backstory of everything. I couldn't be ignorant and say, well, what's the Trump organization? I needed to know, and I think all of us in our business have discovered that people really will talk, and particularly if you give them a straight shot at things.
You once said, in response to a question I asked you in another book you did like 10 years ago, and I was trying to get you to tell me your deepest secrets of reporting. You said, well, the lies in the day and truth at night.
I think there's some truth to that.
You said it. So were your calls mainly at night? Were your calls with him mainly in the evening?
Yes, yeah, they were.
So
and
can you explain?
Pardon?
Can you explain that technique or that belief that you developed?
Well, the night is at least theoretically somebody, they have their own life, and tell a story of working on I think it was the fourth Bush book, George W. Bush's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there was a general who would not talk. And emails, phone messages, intermediaries, even had people call and say, you ought to talk to him, he's going to listen. Radio silence. So I found out where he lived in the Washington area. Now, when would you go knock on the door of a 4-star general?
Yeah. Well,
when would you go?
I would go after they came home and maybe had one drink.
Okay, so that would be
I wouldn't
8:17 on a Tuesday. It actually is the best time. You want to do it on not Mondays, not at the end of the week. Tuesdays are great. 8:15, 8:17 is that time. If it's a special time,
right?
And maybe somebody's had a few pops. So I went, knocked on his door. And he opened the door and looked at me and said, "Are you still doing this shit?" And instead of saying anything or showing any expression, I learned a long time ago from CIA case officers, let the silence suck out the truth. Just be silent. Go.
Yeah.
And so no expression, nothing. He looked at me, got a disappointed look on his face. I think not in me, but in himself, because he said, okay, come on in. Sat for 2 hours, answered the questions pretty much. I went back again and again and developed a trusted relationship with this person, somebody who said no. Now, why? Why did that relationship go from a firm no to a yes? I'm asking you, if I may.
Well, you probably listened, and you knew stuff, and
somebody showed up.
Yeah.
we're not showing up. We're getting lazy. We do it on the internet. We do it on the telephone. We do it. Um, it's particularly difficult during the pandemic, but it's amazing. You can.
Okay.
I looked in, and believe this or not, I looked in an old little phone book. I had address book, personal and professional numbers, and I looked under White House Signal,
Mm-hmm.
which is the number, you probably know the number. And I said, oh, well, I want to reach so and so. I think I'll try this instead of a home phone number. Called White House Signal. They
That's
answered, identified myself. Will you get so and so on the phone and say if he'd ask if he'd be willing to speak to me? And it's amazing.
yeah.
They're 40 years, they haven't changed the number. And so you just use those techniques. I learned those techniques from Carl Bernstein in covering Watergate. People aren't going to talk to you in their offices during the day, or that's the lies during the day, and the truth, the better version of the truth at night.
Yeah. So reflect on or compare the moment that we're in, which we probably all would agree is a crisis, or at least it was a month ago, and if you put COVID in, it still is. Compared to like the second biggest crisis or another crisis, I don't know, you pick it, that you covered. What would have been if COVID hadn't have happened? What would have been the crisis you would have identified as the most challenging to cover as a reporter?
Good question. Wouldn't know, but again, you would cover Trump's actions and words and the policies and his styles. Trump does not plan or think. Everything is impulse. And so it took me a while to, what's the plan, or when was the meeting about what to do?
Right.
There was no meeting.
Yeah.
And I started this in December of last year before the virus, and went to the Oval Office, took out my little tape recorder, plunked it down on the Resolute desk, and said, "This is for a book to come out in September or October. It's all on the record." And he said, "Fine." And we talked a lot about North Korea, because that was an issue, and his relationship with Kim Jong Un, and uh, fascinating. I could have written a book on North Korea, because I got all these letters that were exchanged between Trump and Kim Jong Un. Kim Jong Un says in one of them, Mr. He calls him Excellency. Excellency. Trump loves that. He calls me Excellency. Excellency. This relationship is like a fantasy film, and it was. And then asked about the strategy. You excoriated him. He excoriated you. Tweets back and forth. It looked like there was going to be a war, and then you decided to meet with him, and the foreign policy establishment is critical of you for doing this. And he said, "Look, I gave him one fucking meeting, one fucking meeting, 2 days. Took me 2 days, and he thinks he averted a war. I'm not convinced of it, but we didn't have a war, and lots of people thought there might be a war with with North Korea. So it's what the issues would have been if it hadn't been the pandemic. That's if history. It was the pandemic. His behavior in the way he's handled the pandemic is a catastrophe, a national embarrassment for him, for the country. I mean, here we are, what, 10 months into it, 11 months into the pandemic. And in my reporting, I was able to establish that on January 28th, they told him the whole story about the pandemic is coming. Uh, Matt Pottinger, the deputy national security advisor, who had been a Wall Street Journal reporter in China, knew that the Chinese lie all the time, had good medical sources, and told the president, this is not going to be like the 2003 SARS epidemic, which was suppressed really. It's going to be it's going to be like the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. 100 years ago. That's when 675,000 people were killed because of that. Where are we now? I mean, now they're saying maybe we're at 400,000, really, maybe, I mean, that's where we're heading. And what did the president do? He told me about it. I thought he was talking about China. I didn't learn about that meeting, which is the pivot point in all of this until May. But this, I think, if I may, you haven't asked this question directly, but that all of this since the election is Trump getting the public and the press to take his bait in debate about whether he won. We know he didn't win. He lost, but he's going to string us along, and we've got the worst health crisis in our country in its history. And last night, for 46 minutes, Trump is giving a speech about the election and saying things that are just absurd. You know, many people, everyone believes this, everyone knows this, when there is absolutely no evidence. And what are our grandchildren going to think when they discovered that in the middle of this, that's what the president was doing?
So I want to ask you about the Republicans. You know some of them, and they're the enablers. They're the great enablers because he wouldn't be able to be so successful without their support. So do you think that any of that's going to change under Biden? Have you been talking to people to try to figure out whether the divide that he has created is going to last and be as solid as it is now during the next administration?
I don't think he created the divide. I think it existed. And I had discussions with him about this, that are in the book, that in 2016, the old order in the Republican Party had really vanished. The old order in the Democratic Party had really vanished and not defined itself. And that Trump came along and seized history's clock, really. And he didn't understand the reference, but he understood the idea and said, yeah, I have seized history's clock. And he did. And the question is going to be how you repair this, and whether Biden and Kamala Harris can do that. And it is the largest task with all of the convulsions going on and the pandemic. This is a almost unbelievable situation. And I think his antics and rhetoric and the stunts he pulls have numbed people largely to how completely absurd it is that the president is talking and arguing like this when 2,700 people died yesterday
So are you
because of
hearing
this virus.
Are you hearing anything from Republicans on the Hill about whether they will change either their support for him or try to come together with the Democrats on some things after he leaves?
It's a good question. Um, you 74 million people voted for him. And if you step back and think about it, a vote for Trump is not a casual vote. It's election day. Honey, I'm going to vote. Gee, I can't decide who to vote for. I mean, people have their feet in cement pretty much by that point, and he's got 74 million people uh, agreeing with him, or at least agreeing with enough of him to vote for him. So for the Republicans on the Hill, it's survival. I think they're just counting the days to January 20th. Hope there's no new crisis or new war, and they're they're meek and timid. And in this book Rage, at the end of the book, having done all this reporting, I stepped out of the mode of this. This is what happened. And the last line in the book is that in totality, Trump is the wrong man for the job of president. And some people have criticized me for, would you put that in the end or not? If I can ask you.
I don't think so. I think the book probably speaks for itself.
But
But I
yeah,
would. I mean,
I think that's a fair point. But I was too aware of Republican silence.
yeah,
And people who know he's the wrong man for the job, people who in private have told me
right.
he's the wrong, not just the wrong man for the job. He couldn't be worse for the job.
Yeah.
And they sit in silence. And at the end, I was not going to join the ranks of the silence.
Yeah.
And I just think that once, I mean, the evidence is overwhelming.
So
Just
do you think those
overwhelming.
people, do they sit in silence just because they want to be reelected, or is it something else?
It's survival, and they're hedging. They're hedging. They know that if they come out against Trump, uh, many Republicans are not going to be happy with them, and many, many, many. And so I think there are a lot of crossed fingers waiting till January 20th, when the Trump era can be put behind them. But
Yeah.
it can't. It can't.
Yeah.
I mean, the Republican Party is forever changed, and the whole issue of when you were an elected representative, are people hiring you for your subservience or your conscience? Are they hiring you for your judgment, your sense of fairness and independence and well-being for them, or are you being hired for well-being of yourself as a congressman or
Yeah.
senator?
Yeah. That's so. I have to get in one more question before we start taking questions. Are
Yeah.
you hearing anything about about Trump maybe preparing to make a big surprise? Go to war, do something against Iran. Create some crises. Are you picking anything up like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot. There's been reporting on it. It's uh, nothing solid, but I think anything's possible. I think um, I get the sense just from his public performance and some things he said that he's kind of mellowed and
Hmm.
has decided he can live with leaving office. I think there are interesting questions of pardons for everyone. I well remember the Nixon pardon that Gerald Ford granted. And I remember going to interview Gerald Ford. So it was 1998, 25 years after Watergate. Ford had been out of office for a couple of decades almost. I was doing a book on the legacy of Watergate, went to his home in Rancho Mirage, California, and talked a lot about the pardon. and the criticism of him that he didn't push for an admission from Nixon that he'd committed crimes. And so and then Ford reaches in, pulls out his wallet, goes in, and there's a little newspaper clipping that he pulls out, and it's a clipping from the 1915 Supreme Court decision, Burdick versus United States, in which the Supreme Court says the acceptance of a pardon is acknowledgement of guilt.
Oh, interesting.
Isn't that
So does
interesting?
that mean if he tries pardoning his 3 kids that we can assume they're guilty of something?
Well, the Supreme Court said an
Yeah.
acceptance is admission.
Mm-hmm.
Acceptance is admission. I think it's even a little stronger than that. So
Okay.
there's much to cover still in the remaining 50 days of Trump. But
we don't need to be building bunkers right now. You're saying what you're hearing about some kind of rabble rousing on his part may not be as extreme as war.
well, I think a bunker is a good place to always be, at least psychologically, if not physically.
Comforting.
Anything can happen. Anything can happen with Trump, and at the same time, there's something about him that is. I was watching one of his rallies, and these rallies are pure, adrenaline and firecrackers, and he's there, and he's got tens of thousands of people there, and they're cheering. He said something, and kind of looks back, and he says, I'm with you. And they just go crazy.
Yeah.
I'm with you. So.
Okay. So we'll bring in Sandy with some questions from the audience all over the world.
Yes, thank you. That was a sobering end to that. Bob, let me ask you first. So the media took a lot of heat for how it covered Trump as a candidate in 2015 and 2016. Our conference is all about covering crisis. What in your estimation, how has the media done in covering the Trump presidency? What are your thoughts on how it's behaved?
Well, I think a lot of the coverage has really been good. I think my newspaper, the Washington Post, has done a really excellent job. New York Times has, the television networks by and large. But I think it all could be better. And I think the internet and this culture of impatience and speed has infected all of us. And get it out, summarize it, and I worry, as I was suggesting, about tone in coverage. Sometimes Trump has changed lots of our colleagues, reporters, good reporters. They're just so angry at him because we deal in facts and we're empirical, or we try to be, right? And we know that if you have facts, you can leverage the facts to your benefit. Trump doesn't think that way. Trump, the difference, I think he doesn't know the difference between truth and untruth in many cases. And so it makes it hard and it enrages people.
Mm-hmm.
Great question here from the audience. A little bit of inviting some speculation, but if Deep Throat were in touch with you today, what Trump story do you think it might lead you to?
Who knows? I'm going to go back and move the flower pot on the back balcony. Always hoping, right? You never know.
I know that a lot of people in the Q&A are really asking for some, some insight into your conversations with the president. And the one question I really like is, did you ever discuss with President Trump the influence of Stephen Miller on policy matters?
I did not specifically. Trump, talking to Trump about his staff or cabinet is not that useful, because Trump, the way he looks at it and the way he practices being president, he's a one-man band. It's about him. And, he would, even say, oh, I wrote all these things or I did all these things, when it's not the case.
Well, let's pull the lens out a little bit from Trump. You have interviewed many a president. How have your conversations with President Trump, how do they compare with, say, many of your conversations with President George W. Bush or beyond?
Well, they were different, and as I was saying, no one knew about it. It was kind of, if you will, he was deep throat, and he was so there was a kind of openness. He was obviously trying to make his case, which is fine. He, it's a very interesting experience. I'm going to write a play about it sometime. 9 months in the bunker with Trump, running around the house with my tape recorder, ready to go. I also had a lot of advantages. I could prepare questions. There would be things that happened in the news. It was, there were people on the staff I was talking to.
But
for instance, yes.
Go ahead. Well,
No,
I have to follow up. You said you were running around the house with the tape recorder. So where was the weirdest place you ended up tape recording them?
Well, but sometimes the bedroom, or here in the den, or my office on the 3rd floor, but it wasn't, and what, because I have hearing aids, I need to use a speaker phone, so both will be engaged. So I used a speaker phone and just turned the tape recorder on, and some of it's, he's it's not a new observation. He really is a pure narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, we're talking about the Supreme Court, and he was, and about judges. And he said, well, we put in 300 judges. It was 200 at that point, but he was saying 300, and he was patting himself on the back, how important this was to the Republican Party and Mitch McConnell and to him and his legacy. And I said, wow, you've got, you put in so many federal judges, they're going to put a monument to you outside the Supreme Court. And he said, what a good idea. That's a great idea. Don't tell anyone. And, so I was only joking, but he was, he had the mortar ready.
Well, in the many hours of conversation you had with him, or even in just your assessment of him as president, are there any places you give him credit, or you give him, a passing grade on?
Well, we haven't had a new war. I think that's very important, and some of his skepticism about war in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think, is well founded. I think there's so many things that one of my failings in this was not really going into the tax bill that he passed, because it really is tilted. And I would like to spend a week in a factory town somewhere in Pennsylvania or Michigan and talk to the workers and hear them explain how, Trump's done really good things for them. And then I would get out my whiteboard with the facts and show that the workers been screwed by the Trump tax cut, and I think that's one of the failings. Um, my failing, I think the media is not. I think it's hard not to get caught up in the daily um, story. Dana, you see all of the post coverage, and there are these stories with 4 or 5 bylines,
every day.
and both you and I tend to be lone rangers, right?
Right.
Yeah, sometimes worked with somebody, but certainly not 4 or 5. And I think the dynamics are somebody hears something, and they have a Zoom call, and somebody says, "Well, I can chase down some of that. I can get so and so to comment on it," and so you come up with these 5 byline stories that are. Um, some of them are kind of thin, I think. Would you agree?
Well, yes, but I think that's partly because the news cycle is 24/7 and then minute by minute. There's this great they have to update all the time and so they can put a new
Yeah,
timestamp on it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask when your book was released, or when Rage was released, there were a lot of people saying, why didn't you tell us about what the president was saying in terms of how deadly coronavirus was in February? And I've seen some of your responses of really, there's a distinction to be drawn between, a journalist and a journalist's ethics and an author and an author's ethics, combined with the fact that probably
I
anything.
think that's not my answer. That's bullshit. Um, if you've read the book, you see he told me this in February that it's airborne, that it's 5 times worse than the flu. It was the day after he talked to President Xi of China, and he said that's what he and Xi were talking about. The virus was in uh, China, not in the United States at that time. I thought for sure if he was telling the truth, he was talking about China. If you do this long range, in depth reporting, you discover that you just find out things way down the road. And it was in May, I discovered that Trump was talking about the United States based on this January 28th meeting. I didn't know about that
Mhm.
in February. And so,
Yeah.
it's never even considered putting anything out because it was known what was going on in China. It was on the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times and papers all over. And then in March, when it exploded, everyone knew that it was worse than the flu. Everyone knew that it was airborne. Everyone knew
Mhm.
there was nothing I could tell them at that point. Uh, it's a fair question, but it has no basis in that somehow when people have said, "Oh well, I should have put this out." What would I have put out? That Trump said, she said, things are bad in China. I mean, at this point in February, uh, 700 million people in China were in lockdown.
Yeah.
Well, maybe the last question I'll ask you just before thanking you, and hello, Peter, and hello, Susan, um, is, a lot of people throughout this conference have been nostalgic for a time, that Walter Cronkite represents, where there was trust in journalism. What do you think going forward we need to do as a country, as consumers, and as journalists to kind of look for and restore some of that trust?
I think we need to do a better job. I think we need to be aware of how we project. There was an old Watergate story from 1974. After Nixon resigned, Katharine Graham, the owner publisher of the Washington Post, wrote Carl Bernstein and myself a letter. She had more stationery than any 500 people in Washington, but she wrote it on a yellow legal pad. Dear Carl and Bob, Nixon's resigned. You did some of the stories. Now, don't start thinking too highly of yourselves. And let me give you some advice. And the advice is beware the demon pomposity. And that is really good advice for all of us in journalism, that the demon pomposity stalks the halls, not just the media institutions, the Senate and the House, politics, government, Wall Street, academia, you name it. There's a lot of pomposity, and I think it is a barrier for people doing their job or people observing somebody do their job, and it's something to work on to bleach out.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate this enormously, and best of luck to you in your next project.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Nice to see you.
Nice seeing you.
Take
There's
care.
no pomposity in academia, is there?
Not in my little office.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye now.
Well, thank you very much. And now we are going to welcome Peter Baker and Susan Glasser to the stage. Good afternoon, good evening.
Hi guys. How you doing?
Hi. Oh, nice to see you.
Great to see
Good
you.
to see you. It's been too long.
I know. How are you doing? You look great. Everybody looks healthy.
Here we are in our living room, you know.
COVID free.
How old is Theo now? Sorry, you guys. I haven't seen them for a while. How old is Theo now?
He is an 11th grader. He is turning 16. So.
Oh my gosh. Oh, okay. Back to business. Sorry. He was born in the, not in the newsroom, but almost, right?
Almost the news.
Almost. I was technically working that day.
Yeah, I bet you were. I have no doubt.
Well, let me just quickly introduce both
try to
of
get
you.
a bit edgewise, Sandy.
Let me introduce both of you, and then I'll click off and let you talk with Dana. So, Peter Baker, welcome, Peter. Peter's the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, a political analyst for MSNBC, an author of Days of Fire and The Breach, and another book we're about to talk about in a second. And Susan Glasser, welcome, Susan. She's the author of the New Yorker's weekly letter from Trump's Washington, as well as a CNN global affairs analyst. She's a founding editor of Political Magazine and former editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy Magazine. And together, these two have written the recently released The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. Welcome to the Journalism Under Fire stage. We look forward to hearing your remarks, and I'll turn it over to you three.
Thank you, Sandy. Appreciate it.
Okay, I have to say also, Susan was an editor at the Washington Post, and that's where she met Peter. I believe you were his editor at the time, so you guys were really in trouble there for a while.
To be clear, not technically his boss.
Okay. It all worked out. Okay, so I can't figure out if your book about Howard Baker is excellent timing or really poor timing. Because there's both so much to learn from him, and it seems so like another era. So first, for the audience, because we have a lot of students, we have people from overseas, and then we have old farts that are going to remember Howard Baker. Can you first give us who is he, and then why is he relevant to what we're going through?
Well, it's a great question. We actually didn't start this book because of the Trump era. We started 7 years ago, actually. But it turned out to be very relevant to today, because we look at, not only we look at Jim Baker as the Secretary of State and White House Chief of Staff and Treasury Secretary and all these important jobs, we look at Washington, because Washington was a character in this book as well, like how Washington worked back then. And inevitably, that's the context for today, right? How things don't work today, how things have changed since the era of Jim Baker and Reagan and Bush and even Clinton and so forth. And I think that one of the things we really wanted to do with this book was look at Washington as a character as well as our subject.
Okay. And so did you get to know him from your Russia coverage, or how did you get to know him?
The journalistic equivalent of a cold call, more or less. Peter and I should say, by the way, that Peter, although his last name is Baker, is no relation to Jim Baker.
Oh, we got together family reunion, yeah.
The distant Greek side of the family, notwithstanding. No, look, Peter and I were too young to cover sort of the events of the end of the Cold War and this sort of momentous period, really from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War, when Jim Baker was sort of running Washington. But I think, certainly because we've been correspondents for the Post in the former Soviet Union, only a decade after those events, we had a real understanding and appreciation of what a sort of momentous and consequential period that was. But the real thing is that it's kind of amazing that Baker, who was such a unique figure in modern Washington, Tom Donilon, who was Barack Obama's national security advisor, he said to us when I ran into him one day, Jim Baker is perhaps the most important unelected official since the end of the World War II period. And the fact that nobody had actually done a biography of Baker was really just sort of an accidental stroke of luck, I think, especially because Peter and I both saw it as the chance to write the story not only about a pretty exceptional American life. It's really unusual to have the combination of roles that he had. In fact, no one else really has in modern Washington. He ran 5 different national presidential campaigns, and he had these very important policy roles, Treasury Secretary, White House Chief of Staff, and Secretary of State. And so I think we both saw it as an opportunity really to, look at Washington when it worked in a way that pretty fundamentally it doesn't work anymore.
So explain a bit about what you mean by that, because he is that figure. He's a great figure for that era. So how would you describe that era for people who've never lived through it?
Who don't remember when Republicans and Democrats could sit down and work out their differences at a table? It's really something, because we're in an era where both Republicans and Democrats agree there should be COVID relief. And it's been April since anybody could actually come up with a deal, and they still don't have a deal, which is just unthinkable, right? That they actually agree on this and they can't come up with a deal. So when Baker was at the height of power in Washington, he could be a knife fighter during election campaigns. As Susan mentioned, he ran 5 presidential campaigns. He wasn't a softie or or any kind of kumbaya guy. But when the election was over, he believed in sitting down with the other side and working out deals. So as White House Chief of Staff, he sat down with the Democrats in 1983. He worked out a deal to reorient all of Social Security, to put it on a firmer financial basis. Hadn't happened up until that point. Hasn't happened again since then on a bipartisan basis. 1986. Treasury Secretary sat down with the Democrats, rewrote the entire tax code, top to bottom. Hasn't happened again since then on a bipartisan basis. 1989, Secretary of State sits down with the Democrats, resolves the Contra Wars. For those who don't remember it, in the 1980s, that was a big issue in Washington, the fight between the communists and the American-backed freedom fighters in Nicaragua. Baker made that go away in a deal with Democrats like Jim Wright and Jimmy Carter. So that's what you don't see today. Like at the time, you could fight pitched battles in the election arena, but when it was over, you actually try to get stuff done. The point of being elected was to get stuff done, and today it's sort of the opposite.
So let's talk about that. I'm obsessed with trying to figure out how did we get here, but how are we here? How are there people on the Hill who we all have known as reporters who, I want to say used to be decent people. I kind of hope they still are down deep, but yet they are unwilling, like as you say. So a lot of the Republicans up there. You guys probably know Washington, better than 99.9% of anybody in Washington. So how do you explain this inability to compromise? See the other, yeah.
Dana, it obviously this is the great conundrum of the Trump years, and we're all going to keep circling back to it, no matter what our answers are at any given moment, because it's gonna, it fills you with kind of rage and disbelief at any given moment in time. Look what's happening right now. The president of the United States is making fantastical, wildly untrue claims from the White House that there's some massive international conspiracy across multiple states to steal the election from him.
And no Republicans are standing
up. No one is condemning him, right? So obviously, how did this happen? How did we get here? One thing I would say that goes along with what Peter is telling about the system working, it wasn't out of some nobility, I should hasten to add, on the part of Jim Baker or George H.W. Bush. I mean, look, these were, I think they were men of more decent character, certainly, than the current occupant of the White House. But in the end, right, it also was about incentives. The political incentives to make a deal have disappeared, and structural changes to our politics have disappeared in a way that also pull both right and left away from the table with each other. And, you know, the fragmenting of the media, by the way, is one very significant reason that the world is a different world than the world of the 1980s and the 1990s in Washington. That's one reason. The, you know, obviously the extensive gerrymandering and districts that never make you accountable to kind of centrist voters in the middle, but, you know, are all about catering to the mass of your own party that's stuck in there and avoiding a primary challenge no matter what. That is a major structural change from the Washington of Jim Baker's era. The amount of money in politics and the way that you need to raise money, that's a huge change structurally from Baker's era. And I could go on. So there are actual reasons that transcend the individuals. But then we've seen in the Trump era, and I have to say this very strongly because I really think it is important that individuals make a difference too. And that was, for Peter and I, that was a big takeaway from the story. You know, in hindsight, it all looks inevitable, but in reality, it's not necessarily inevitable. And I actually think that having someone like Jim Baker, who was not a right-wing ideologue, a culture warrior, very conservative guy, I should hasten to add, but he was an outsider to Ronald Reagan's circle. He came in, he was a very successful chief of staff. Look, it was Jim Baker who pushed for Sandra Day O'Connor to be the first woman on the Supreme Court. And the conservatives, even then, were very suspicious of her and thought, you know, she's not going to be the kind of justice that we want. Baker physically blocked them from meeting with Ronald Reagan. Individuals matter. Who gets the job matters. Donald Trump's divisiveness does matter, even though there are these other structural reasons for our current dysfunction that predate Trump.
So can you think of let's go back to Obama for a minute. You know, there was such a division even then, the Republicans not willing to compromise much. Was there a James Baker figure in either the Republican Congress or the White House who managed to do some kind of something like that?
I think there were people who wanted to be like that, people who have instincts like that. Obviously, you know, John McCain worked across the aisle when he was a major senator. I think Leon Panetta, you know, was a figure who liked to work across the aisle. Bob Gates worked for both Republican and Democratic presidents. I think Joe Biden liked to work across the aisle as vice president. He was the one that Obama would send to meet with Mitch McConnell and work out deals. But I think that the difference between them and Baker is that the environment that Susan describes was even then so much more difficult than it was back in the 80s and 90s. And we don't think of the 80s and 90s as a halcyon period of, you know, bipartisan comedy, but by comparison to today, it was at least a sort of more rational era, I think, in the sense of ability to work across aisle. He didn't automatically reject everything that the other side would say. And so I think there are people who would like to be Jim Bakers, who have the same instincts that he does, but that the opportunity and the environment has changed so drastically.
And then under Trump, were there at least like whisperers who would not be, you know, who would be behind the scenes telling the Democrats something? I don't know. I always have the feeling that some of the people that worked for Trump were there just to make sure that the finger didn't hit the button or something. Is that your sense too? You covered the White House.
You know? Oh yeah, I would say yes. I mean, certainly at the beginning of the Trump era anyway, a number of people who went into work for him had the theory that they were there to keep things from going off the rails, right? That they felt that they could manage him, that they could steer him, they could guide him. Remember, of course, Trump is our only president ever in the history of the country without a single day of experience in either the military or government. So these people thought, I think, for patriotic reasons, that they could be of service. And I think they discovered, of course, that Trump didn't really want that. He didn't want them to tell him what to do. He didn't want to listen to them. And one by one, they were gone. Tillerson, Kelly, McMaster, Mattis, all these people who thought they could steer him were pushed out. And in the second term, the second part of his term, you saw poor people that were more conducive to what he wanted to do. And I think you saw a different kind of presidency at that point.
Yeah. And what about your Republican sources on the Hill or elsewhere? Are they waiting and then we'll see something different, or they just don't have any room, or yeah, first that, because I got a million questions for you.
Well, look, of course, there's different groups, I think, of Republicans, and you'll see different things. You will definitely see, a certain group of more establishment type Republicans who pretend that they had not a damn thing to do with Donald Trump. And you can already see the glimmering of that revisionism happening now. One of the things that's been kind of notable, right, especially in the last year or so of the Trump presidency, has been the extent to which Republican senators who used to get tied up in knots defending this or that crazy Trump tweet, in the last year, they've actually learned a different game, which is, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with what you're talking about. I don't have any comment with that. I'm late for lunch. I got to go. They basically have just sort of washed their hands of Trump while trying to benefit politically from him back in their home districts or states. And, there was this remarkable scene this week. Right now, you have a situation where actually more leaders of foreign countries have recognized Joe Biden's victory and congratulated him on it than Republican members of the United States Senate. And yet, remarkably, this week, you actually had a number of senators who have refused to acknowledge the results of the presidential election, nonetheless go to the floor of the United States Senate and make speeches criticizing Joe Biden's nominees for the cabinet. And, to me, that is that sums up this moment in Washington, the incredible hypocrisy. And this is even before January 20th. So to your question, will there be some Republicans who just pretend they never had anything to do with Donald Trump, despite having gone along with the whole thing? The answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. And are there people now, but it all sounds just for expediency. All of it sounds like it's only so that they can get reelected. And I don't know, even being in Washington as long as I have, I kind of always wanted to feel like there was the person that's willing to fall on their sword at a certain point, but it doesn't sound like it. So is it that bad?
Well, the person is Mitt Romney. So there is one person. Mitt Romney is in fact, the only person in U.S. Senate history who ever voted to convict in an impeachment trial that a president of his own party. There's only been one in all of U.S. history in the four different impeachment trials that we've had. Now, I would say, this group of people that I'm talking about, this sort of more Republican establishment types, genuinely probably really don't like Donald Trump and held their noses and sort of went along with it. There is a different group in the Senate and among Republican elected officials who are more enthusiastic about Donald Trump. Why is that? Is that because they love him personally? I doubt it. I think it does have more to do with them feeling that he's unlocked the key to a kind of enthusiasm among their voters that they're eager to continue tapping into, that they may believe in, that they think is kind of the future of the party to go in a more populist, nationalist, right-wing vein than the party had been going under George W. Bush and Mitt Romney.
Yeah. So, Peter, I think people would love to hear how it is to cover the White House. I mean, do you ever sleep anymore?
Well, look, we've kind of gotten used to it, but you're right. I mean, when this president came in, suddenly he would tweet things out at 5:30 in the morning, at 11 o'clock at night. When they told us that he had tested positive for COVID, that was 1 o'clock in the morning. There was never a sense that any time was ever going to be off limits. I mean, under other presidents, this is my fourth president. Under other presidents, there obviously be moments of crisis when you would have to do stuff early in the morning or late at night. But there was never a sense that anything could happen at any given time because the president just simply decided to say something, right? In other words, this is a president who reacted to what he saw on television, particularly Fox News, and then suddenly, boom, 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 he tweets something out as an impulse, and an entire story line is created that would never have existed otherwise. Any other president would, of course, try to discipline himself or herself when we get to that point, and sticking to the message that they planned for the day if they could. And only if outside forces, prevailed upon them would they talk about anything else. This is a president who, from moment to moment, he's living in 10-minute increments. And that means the reporters who cover him are living in these 10-minute increments too. Susan would always joke that I would write one and sometimes even two stories in the morning by 8:30 before I even got out of my jammies, because he would just boom, 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 be starting some big Twitter thread or whatever. Now we stopped getting quite so excited about his Twitter feed, as time went on, and we got used to it, I suppose. But you're right; he's a very unpredictable, erratic, and guy. The flip side is he talked to us a lot, and therefore that was also a news generator. I mean, we haven't really talked to Biden all that much. We haven't talked to Trump since the election for the most part. One or two examples, but for the most part, he would mostly talk to us every day. So at any given time, he was making news, and he didn't care if it was off message. And in fact, that made him happier if it was.
So can you explain a little bit more, sort of behind the scenes of when something like that happens, when he tweets something? You're not just regurgitating the tweet. You're doing what? Who you're calling people? What are you doing?
Well, one of the first things he tried to do is figure out what he was just watching on TV in order to understand what he's talking about, right? Because he talks in code, and unless you're watching whatever Fox News or OAN now segment he might be watching, you might not even understand what he's talking about, because it's sort of shorthand.
So you started watching Fox News or recording it, or what?
Yeah. And there are services you can go back and watch. So he tweets at 8:36 a.m. about X. Like, well, you don't know anything about X. X might be, say, a war criminals case involving some Navy SEAL you never heard of, right? So he tweets that at 8:36. So you go back and look at what was being talked about at Fox at 8:34 in order to figure out what he's even just factually what he's talking about. And of course, obviously, it's our job then to fact check it, to say what's really going on, because he's not bothering to fact check it. He's not going to his staff and going to the Pentagon and going to this extraordinary government that he presides over to say, hey, what are the facts before I issue my opinion? He just simply reacts like that off of something he sees on TV and off to the races. So it's our job to fact check. We put in a fact checker at the beginning of his term in our bureau, whose job was not just to fact check him, everybody, but he was a predominant part of her job. The Washington Post, your old place, our former place, is done a fantastic job with Glenn Kessler and his team of fact checkers of keeping track of all the different false statements this president's made, and that's been part of our job in a way that we haven't seen even under previous presidents.
So are you picking up anything about Trump sort of pulling a fast one at the end in terms of creating a crisis, going to war, doing something? How worried should we be about that?
I mean, look, I would say that those whose job it is to care about the national security of this country are very worried. And that's probably one of the lesser appreciated themes of the Trump presidency, certainly the late stage of it, is, a genuine rift between Trump and the national security establishment. And in fact, now he's just gotten rid of a second defense secretary. One of the first things he did after losing the election to Joe Biden was to fire Mark Esper, his second Secretary of Defense. Now, this is kind of a remarkable turnabout, by the way, because Esper had been placed in there after Jim Mattis and was seen inside the Pentagon, your old stomping grounds, as being so sycophantic toward Trump originally that his nickname was Yesper. But what happened was there was this, I was going to say famous, but the truth is infamous photo op in June, at the beginning of June, during the protests over George Floyd's killing. And remember, Trump and Barr ordered the violent use of violent force to clear Lafayette Square in front of the White House so there could be a photo op. Now, with Trump marching across the square to St. John's Church were Esper, the Secretary of Defense, and Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That was a terrible breach of our norms and traditions, and right away they came under justifiably enormous criticism. Both of them apologized for participating in that photo op and seemed to recognize that they were in serious danger of losing the support even of their own officers and their own troops. And of course, this infuriated Donald Trump, and so that's the background to a real hostile moment. But think about that and how scary that is in the context of a president who shows no signs of being worried to be ratcheting up the pressure on Iran. There's just been this assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist. It appears that Israel may have been responsible, but Israel has been heavily coordinating almost all of its actions on Iran with the hawks who run Middle East policy for Donald Trump. So I think that's a risk. I'm looking at places like Iraq right now, where there are Iranian-backed militias, and there's a real concern that I've heard expressed here in Washington. What if there is an errant missile that injures or kills U.S. personnel there, and Trump decides to respond with enormous force? We could be looking at a kind of flashpoint situation. So I think, again, there's just under 50 days between now and January 20th. And I don't think a lot of people are really going to be sleeping easily until that is noon 01 on January 20th.
Okay. Thanks for the comforting thoughts. So the theme of the conference is covering crisis, which I feel like, that's really what we've been talking about. But I want to give people a little bit of a comparison, since you guys really have covered so many crises. What would you pick as before the presidency here? What was the most difficult crisis that you faced in terms of coverage, and what did it feel, and why was it so hard?
Look, for Peter and I, there's no question that the September 11th attacks and the subsequent war in Afghanistan, we were, young foreign correspondents. We were just married. We had just arrived in Moscow. I grew up in the suburbs. I don't know about you, but I never heard a gun fired. And all of a sudden, the 9/11 attacks occurred. And, it took us a couple days of watching TV and shock and horror before we looked at the map. And we realized that Moscow was about as close as you can get to Central Asia and to Afghanistan. And, not that long after, Peter ended up being the first U.S. newspaper correspondent in Afghanistan after 9/11 in northern Afghanistan with the Northern Alliance. I ended up covering the Battle of Tora Bora, something for which I was about as completely unprepared as you can possibly imagine. And, for us, that was almost the literal definition of, journalism trial by fire. And so this is a very different kind of crisis, although, as someone who still is very much interested in foreign policy, what I say to people is, like, for the last 4 years, this is the biggest geopolitical story in the world. If you want to know about geopolitical conflicts, like, this is it. It's right here in Washington.
Yeah. And, in trying to come to peace personally, day to day with what's happening, I often look back on 9/11 and say, what did I learn? I learned that nothing stays the same. Things get better. We increase in our understanding of why things happened and of the world. But I can't say that I can use that today, because I feel like the world is so turned upside down that I don't see how it rights itself. But how do you see it? I mean, how do we get out of this crisis? And
okay, Peter's the family optimist, so go ahead.
I don't know. It's a tough time. I mean, we had as many people die of COVID in the United States yesterday as people died on 9/11 almost. I mean, just like 2,780 some people died of COVID, I think, yesterday, which is just a couple hundred shy of the 3,000
No,
who
it's
died.
more than 3,000.
Well,
yesterday.
Whatever the exact number is roughly comparable. And we're having that every single day. And so it's a rolling crisis. I mean, 9/11 turned out to be a one-time thing that led us to react to it in a way that created years of conflict and understandably perhaps. But this is a continuing, unending crisis that has continued without abatement. And we do see an end in sight, we think, with the vaccine. So that's a good thing. To be an optimist, I'd like to think that we can look forward to the spring, but there's a lot of pain that's going to happen between now and then. And I think that's something we haven't really fully come to grips with.
Well, and I'm actually more talking about the political divide and the willingness of so many people to believe quote unquote news sources that aren't, it does feel a lot like Russia. What is the truth? I hear people say, do you even know what the truth is anymore? And how do we get ourselves out of that?
Well, and we're never going to completely get out of it because we're in a different environment, right? So when Dana, when you and I and Susan were young, um, there were 3 networks, and
Right.
CNN was new, and a handful of big papers and the wires and the news magazines, and we all were more or less starting from the same fact set. So that we had big debates, as we should in society, but we were starting from the same, knowledge, right? And arguing about what it meant. And today, the fragmentation of the media, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, but in the terms of the consequence for our polarization, what it means is you can go to your corner of the information sphere and stay there and never leave and have a completely different view of the world than your neighbor or your friend or your cousin or your uncle who sees the world in a radically different way. And you're not even meeting on the same set of facts. And I don't know that that can change. I don't know how we change that. Now, you do have a president who has exacerbated that, who has encouraged that, who has tried not to bring people together, but to divide people. George Bush said he wanted to be a uniter, not a divider. Well, Donald Trump wants to be a divider, not a uniter. That's just part of his character and part of his political persona. And he has encouraged in these last few weeks the idea that something bad happened in this election, even though there's absolutely no evidence for it whatsoever, and it has an impact. The polls show that 1/2 or more of Republicans actually believe something happened bad, that the election was somehow rigged. And in fact, there's zero evidence of that whatsoever. And that's a damaging thing. So having somebody who's not like that in the White House will make a difference, Republican or Democrat. It's not about partisanship. It's about fidelity to truth and trying, to bring people together. Republican and Democratic presidents have always thought it was their job to try to bring people together, even in time of division. But that hasn't been what we've seen in the last 4 years. So we'll see what happens in the months to come. I am an optimist. I'm an optimist about America. I'm an optimist about our politics, but it's been hard, I think, the last number of years.
Okay. So for both of you, and then I think we're going to have some audience questions. Well, I know we are. But when you look at how your news institutions changed during the presidency, during the Donald Trump presidency, in covering what was, I think it's fair to say a continuing crisis of one sort or another. How did they adapt? How did they learn from their mistakes? And what were some of their mistakes in the beginning?
It's a good question. I mean, I was the editor of Politico during the 2016 election cycle. And, I would say that there was sort of a narrative that I don't agree with about, well, how did we end up with Donald Trump? In the sense that, I remain quite convinced that Trump, even in the 2016 cycle, was the subject of a lot of excellent, hard-hitting investigative reporting, not to mention an entire stack of investigative biographies from even before he had entered political life. I think there's a very fair critique of a lot of the, in particular, cable news coverage at the beginning of his campaign in 2016, that there was a spectacle. Remember all those visuals of the empty plane sitting on the tarmac, waiting for him to come down and say whatever he wanted to say, having him phone in and say random stuff. So I think there's a legitimate question about, whether his early differential treatment and the fundamental lack of seriousness with which many in the media, by the way, myself included, greeted him when he first announced for president might have given him the time and space to acquire the popularity that he then rode to the Republican nomination. But, look, my basic view is, and I know there are people who disagree with this, that it was not for lack of hard-hitting journalism that Donald Trump became president, and that if you really wanted to know about Donald Trump's character, his background, and frankly, a lot of stuff that would prove uncannily accurate about him as president, you already knew that on election day in 2016. So going forward, him as president, that I think actually he's affected the institution of journalism in Washington, how we cover the president far more in many ways, because fundamentally what we've learned is that much of what we thought of as sort of sacrosanct things in Washington turned out to be norms and traditions that were blown up and pretty easily blown up by the president. Many of them may not come back, by the way, under presidents of either party. And that includes a kind of transparency and access to the press, not just in the White House, but in the executive agencies that, could be a real blow to future coverage. So I'm extremely worried about the long-term journalistic consequences and damage done by the Trump presidency in that sense. I also think, that it just became harder and harder in a situation where the media is so fragmented and there is a powerful and large media outlet like Fox News that's willing to amplify a president's lies and to serve as a form of state television. This is something really different in the American media landscape. And by the way, different even than the role that Fox played in critiquing and attacking Barack Obama, which it did during his presidency. And again, that's something we just haven't seen. And I think it bodes very, it's scary. It's scary for what it means going forward.
What would you say, Peter, about what the New York Times learned along the way about covering the president?
Look, it's a challenge. It is a challenge because we want to both be fair and accurate and balanced, and at the same time not hold back when things are not true. The idea that a story has to include both sides is built into our DNA. The idea that a story is fair because we quote people who have different points of view, that is at the heart of what mainstream journalism has been for several generations. The idea that we would try to give voice to different points of view. And then there's the Trump presidency when it's not simply a matter of like, here's one point of view and here's another point of view. It's a matter of like 22,000 as measured by our friend Glenn Custer, we just talked about, false and misleading statements. I mean, the volume of dishonesty that has come from the White House, I think, has challenged the New York Times and other mainstream media to find a way to call that out without being taking sides, right? It's not our job to be the resistance or to be the opposition. And what worries me a little bit is that because I think we have been pretty good and tough in our coverage, as we should be, reacting to the circumstances that we found ourselves in, people might find it disconcerting when we do it to people who are other than Trump and decide, well, wait a second, we thought you were you were supposed to be standing up against Trump, not against somebody else. And it's like, it's not our job to stand up for or against anybody. It's supposed to call out what we see in front of us. And what we saw in front of us in the last 4 years was something we had not seen prior to that. And we had to find a way to say that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks. I see Sandy waiting for wings.
Let me jump in. We have a lot of questions here from the audience. And I have to start with this first one, and it's for you, Peter. And this is from Benedicta Valentiner, who was the chatelaine at Blair House for I think 4 decades.
Wow.
And this is a question really about journalist responsibility, let's say. So she says, listening to your talk with Secretary Baker at Rice University and having known, admired, and worked for the secretary during the Bush years, why did you not push back when Secretary Baker outlined his reasons for supporting Trump in this election, i.e. that he, Baker, was a Republican, a conservative, deeply religious, and scared to death of what a Biden administration would do? While you, Peter Baker, did seem surprised at his reply, you could have gone after him in some way, questioning how, as a deeply religious person, one could accept the venom, cruelty, nastiness, and so on coming out of the White House. It's a big question.
That's a good question. I appreciate the question. Look, we have had those conversations with Jim Baker. We spent basically 5 years having these conversations with Jim Baker as we did our book. And it surprised us because we did think that here was Jim Baker who was a traditional Republican who did not stand for the kinds of things that Trump stands for, who conducted himself with dignity and integrity while he was in public office for the most part, and who wouldn't stand for the kind of fear-mongering and dishonesty that we have come to see. And we were surprised that he continued to say he would vote for Donald Trump. And we did press him on this repeatedly over 5 years. So, as Susan has often said, at a certain point, if the subject of your biography tells you to give you the same answer to the same question you asked for 5 years, at some point you have to accept the answer. That's who he is and what he decided to do. That was his compromise was, I don't support the guy in the sense that I'm not going to endorse him. I'm not going to help him. I'm not going to be on a stage with him, but I will vote for him. And that's his choice in the end, and it's not our job to tell him he made a right choice or a wrong choice. It's our job to ask questions. I think we did that and elucidated it for readers.
So let's go over to Russia for a minute. I want to sort of connect the dots between your time in Russia and, of course, writing on Putin and the White House. What happens next in terms of the Biden administration's approach to Russia? And secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, will we ever know what happened behind closed doors between Trump and Putin? Will we know what really happened in Helsinki when, the 12 Americans were potentially under consideration for being offered up?
Well, look, I was in Helsinki, and it's extraordinary to this day that we don't really know what happened in that meeting, which, by the way, the one-on-one part of that conversation was one that was requested by Donald Trump, which tells you an awful lot. And again, 4 years into this, the fact that we have so many unanswered questions about Trump and Russia is extraordinary. Few secrets really survive through history. It may take a long time to come out. I remain an optimist, at least on this question, that ultimately we will know. I think we'll see one way or the other Donald Trump's tax returns. We'll find out what his business interests were in Russia. We know he was lying publicly in the course of the 2016 campaign when he said he wasn't pursuing the project. And in fact, he was pursuing a project in Moscow. And they were reaching out to Putin's officials. But, it may well turn out, by the way, that Donald Trump just really likes dictators. And he really has a thing for authoritarian strongmen, which is, by the way, not an attribute generally associated with American presidents. So that remains, in my view, a plausible explanation. He's definitely had a long time fascination with the Kremlin and with Russia, even going back to the 1980s. There's this incredible interview that he gave to Playboy in which he was critical of Mikhail Gorbachev at this time and perestroika, because he thought that Gorbachev was not, quote, strong enough to be a real leader of the Soviet Union, at a time when it remained one of the more repressive countries on earth. That was a pretty remarkable and ignorant statement, but revealing, I think, about Donald Trump's view about what constitutes leadership. Anyway, so that's Russia. When it comes to what comes next, I would point out to people that Vladimir Putin is basically the lone holdout among world leaders right now for not having recognized Biden's election and congratulated him on his election. Even Xi Jinping of China has sent a personal message of congratulations to Biden. So Putin remains sort of like, to the end with Donald Trump in this thing, whatever this thing is. There will be an early test of the Biden administration and how it plans to deal with Russia, because the New START nuclear treaty, which was negotiated by the Obama-Biden administration, is set to expire in February. Trump has basically not done much to move it forward. For a long time, they were insisting, in fact, that they wouldn't seek to renew it unless they could get China to be a party to it as well. China had no interest whatsoever in that. And so, I think Biden wants to extend the treaty, wants to keep it going. And so that will be fascinating to see, how do they embark on talks with Russia when Russia isn't even recognizing his victory? And I think that's going to be really interesting.
And Russia wants to extend the treaty as well.
Yeah, Russia does too. Arms control has historically been something that Russia and the Soviet Union before it was very much in favor in it. They saw it as giving it status on the world stage, making them a superpower akin to the United States at a time when their economy is nothing comparable to ours. And, so it's something where there's an interest in both countries in cooperating on. So it might actually be a good first step between the two.
So you both have had rich material to work with for the last 4 years, as have political cartoonists and late night hosts. Is there something that you're looking forward to in terms of a new atmosphere, a new breath, a new aspect, or something to be aware of when it comes to the Biden administration?
Well, in terms of press relations, we're looking forward to not being called enemies of the people and just decried as fake news all the time. Look, again, this is my fourth president. They all complain about their press coverage. Okay, it's built into the system, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the push and pull. We give them a hard time. They complain about it. But what's different about this last 4 years is taking it to the level of this fake news, enemies of the people stuff, which is Stalinist language, which is language that's used to discredit the very idea of a free press, not just a specific article that you don't like or a specific reporter that you think is unfair. And so what I hope we can do, and I'm looking forward to, is getting back to a little more even keel where we can have a professional, if adversarial relationship. Adversarial relationship is built into the system, but it doesn't have to be this, this sort of toxic environment in which we're really just, again, questioning the whole idea of a free press.
Can I ask you a follow up on that? The other thing that might happen is there might be a real drop in readership, because if one thing was clear, Trump was a draw. You had to click so many times a day just to make sure the world didn't blow up. So that's going to be a depressing effect on journalism. How do you? Is there going to be a tendency to not have that happen and somehow feed the beast that's been fed all these 4 years?
Susan's going to be so mad when I wake up at 5:30 and I'm kind of twitching and saying, well, where's that first tweet of the day? And
yeah, I don't think that's not the part I'm worried about. But Dana, I think you're right to be worried about, the sort of economic consequences of the, Trump, this is something he said where I agree with him. He used to joke and brag that he was the best thing that happened to the no longer failing New York Times. And there was a Trump boom in terms of audience and interest in national coverage. I think that's absolutely right. Now, in a positive sense, many organizations like the New York Times have, spent the last few years converting to a more, subscriber based and therefore potentially more durable audience. And, I imagine at the New York Times, a lot of the reason for their boon in subscriptions is Trump, but a lot of it is also the innovations that they've made in journalism and their cooking section, which is fantastic. And their crossword puzzles and all of this, right? And so, we're just living in a much more online way. And I suspect that a lot of the subscription effort that many organizations have had will probably serve them well in this transition. It's much more at the local level. We're facing a terrible, even existential crisis of local journalism, and anything that you can do as listeners to support your local news organizations is so important right now.
I couldn't agree more. Well, Peter Baker, Susan Glasser, thank you so much for taking the time. That was fascinating. Again, their new book is The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. I wish you all the best with the book and, of course, on your new projects and a new administration. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Dana, thank you so much. Sandy, thank you. Have a great evening. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
And then, folks, there's one other thing to mention, which is that tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, Dana and I will be taking your questions, taking your comments, taking your thoughts, your ideas, the major things you learned or didn't learn. We want to hear it all. Let's have a great conversation. That's tomorrow at 10. I think originally we were just going to have our all conference ticket holders to it, but I think we can change that now, and we'll just invite anybody who would like to come. Let's have a big party tomorrow at 10 in the morning. If you'd like to come, email Shelley, SHELLEY, at sfcir.org. We'll get you a link. And Dana, thank you once again. And
my pleasure. That was so much fun. What great people.
What a tour that was of the world. Amazing. Well, thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow morning. And to everybody else, have a great night and sleep well.
Definitely.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.